are back and developing tonight some new questions about what would actually happen if terrorists used a virus like Ebola to carry someone across the border who had it and start a terrorist attack. So more than a decade ago, a group of U.S. counterterror and health experts wanted to see what might happen if something like smallpox were injected into the population intentionally. And the conclusions in this test were dire. Here's a small part of the simulation results.
No group claims responsibility for unleashing the deadly smallpox virus. Demonstrations for more vaccine in hard-hit communities disintegrated into riots and looting around the nation. A national suspension of trading on America's stock exchanges takes effect tomorrow. The Centers for Disease Control reports that efforts to stem the smallpox epidemic have depleted America's inventory of smallpox vaccine. Officials now question whether a single attack could be responsible for this outbreak pattern developing in the U.S.
So that was part of the simulation. As part of it, they had, a pretend newscast showing what people would be told if something like this were to happen. Mark Thiessen's former presidential speechwriter and a Washington Post columnist and an American Enterprise Institute fellow. Mark, good evening. Good to have you with us.
Good to be with you, Martha.
This is the scenario that a terrorist, instead of being a suicide bomber and strapping a bomb to himself, allows himself to become sick with this disease and then moves in the population intentionally trying to cough on things and sneeze on people and spread it in ways that he can. Perhaps even several of these people entering the country with the intention of surreptitiously spreading it, correct?
That's exactly right. So this took place in 2001, a few months before the 9/11 attacks. And it was a group of actually former Clinton administration officials who ran this exercise at Andrews Air Force Base. And what they found was it was a scenario where it was a bioweapons attack on the U.S. by terrorists, where they released smallpox at 3 shopping malls around the country. And what they found was the results were absolutely staggering. The healthcare system was completely overwhelmed. There were riots at vaccination centers. The National Guard had to be called in to put down the violence. International trade stopped. Canada and Mexico closed their borders with the United States. No country would receive planes that had either originated from or transited through the United States. It was a absolutely massive, and in the end, up to 1 million people died in the simulation from smallpox. So the question is, could this happen with Ebola?
It is a good question. And you think about, we had a couple of school systems shut down because of this, and that's just a microcosm. You had a couple of people infected. At least we hope that is the end of it. We don't know, of course. But, what makes me think about, in World War II, you had bomb shelters. You had families constantly practicing what they would do if something were to happen. And I think there is a mentality in this country that, it's never going to happen. So that's how you end up with hospitals. We'll have little baggies that say, here's your Ebola kit, because it's just not something that we are willing, for whatever reason, to actually be prepared for.
No, exactly. So if it's never going to happen, if Thomas Duncan could get on a plane knowing that he was exposed to it and come into the United States and fly to Dallas, why couldn't an Ebola-infected terrorist come in? I mean, one of the things that's interesting is Ebola, according to Dr. Scott Gottlieb, my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, it's actually the perfect bioweapon, because unlike smallpox, which is very hard to obtain, a terrorist simply has to go to an Ebola-affected area and infect himself. It has a 21-day incubation period, which is more than enough time for one or more terrorists to infect themselves and come over to the United States. And then the nightmare scenario would actually be if an Ebola-infected terrorist blew himself up in a crowded area, like a shopping mall or an airport or a train station, spreading infected tissue and turning it into a hot zone. So these are things that could actually happen, and we have to be very careful. We have to be worried about it.
Yeah, and prepared, for different scenarios. Mark, it's called Dark Winter, that original experiment, and it certainly would be. We hope it doesn't happen, but you got to be prepared for everything. Mark, thank you very much. Good to talk to you.
Thanks, Martha. Good to talk to you.
So President Obama this week